current and former coaches, athletic administrators, and coach pedagogy experts, who will examine why too many college coaches and coaches at other levels continue to demonstrate behaviors that negatively impact the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of college athletes, and how this issue could and should be addressed. We all want to be clear, however, this webinar is not an indictment of the coaching profession. There are fantastic coaches who do things the right way and are effective leaders and mentors for athletes at all levels. However, research shows that three things have emerged as structural precipitants of athlete stress. One, the time spent on athletics activity. Two, boorish coaching behavior. And three, the militarization of athletics. Considering the ubiquitous news on player hazing issues, such as what happened at Northwestern University, this panel will examine why coaches continue to exhibit behaviors that can negatively impact the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of athletes, and discuss strategies to remedy unprofessional coaching behaviors, including the need for and challenges of a required and consistent coaching certification program, something that is not required in many areas of the United States, and that is different from most other developed nations that have structured and required coach certifications at all levels of athletic competition. Some of the other questions we will consider today: are there domestic or foreign programs that should be emulated nationwide? And is it feasible to implement similar training and certification systems or sports policies in United States college athletic programs, scholastic, and even youth sports? What are the challenges of implementing coach training and certification programs? What about athlete complaint procedures, whistleblower protections, mandatory reporters, and are there important solution elements in those areas? When coaches are accused of abusive practices, how do we ensure fair investigation and adjudication? Does college sport and other levels of sport need the enforcement power of banning coaches' employment? On almost a daily basis, we find media reports about allegations of abusive practices in college sports and elsewhere. At the collegiate, Olympic, youth, and scholastic sports levels, this is especially acute as the athletes, for the most part, have little recourse or ability to challenge or report these practices. As always, our webinars will focus on solutions and best practices to improve intercollegiate athletics in several ways, and by extensions, other levels of sports competition. Sports competition started at intercollegiate athletics in America, and the tentacles of college athletics reach every level of sports. Today's webinar is an important and needed discussion for anyone with an interest or involvement in the industry. Our excellent panel today is well equipped to discuss the problems as well as the solutions to what sadly has been a consistent problem, certainly here in the United States. Our stellar panel today consists of Dr. Connie Zotos, a current senior associate with Sports Management Resources and former athletic director at Drew University. Dr. Zotos has over 40 years of experience as a faculty member and a college coach at the NCAA Division II and III levels. Dr. Zotos was also a three-time Conference Coach of the Year in basketball. Dr. Dan Lytle is the current head men's lacrosse coach at Drew University and is an expert on leadership, organizational leadership, coaching, and sports psychology. He has several peer-reviewed publications to his credit and is the author of the book entitled Team Turnarounds. Dr. Vincent Harris is the current project manager of the Aspen Institute's Sports and Society program and Project Play, school sport and coaching portfolios. He is a former Division III basketball player and has extensive international experience, specifically in New Zealand, in coach development as a trainer and national consultant. Wayne Moss is the current executive director of the National Council on Youth Sports and has been a major figure in the youth sports space for decades, including a stint as the senior director of sports, fitness, and recreation for the Boys and Girls Club of America, and has several leadership positions to his credit in city recreation in Cleveland and Atlanta. The format of the webinar is each panelist will have 3 to 5 minutes for an opening statement. They will highlight their expertise and where they see the main problems of coach and prevalence of coach abuse tactics in America, including addressing some of the questions I raised earlier. In addition, each panelist will propose what they think are the best solutions and practices to address these issues. After the opening statements, I will begin the Q&A sessions with questions from me, but also from you, the viewing audience. We look forward to an educational, lively, and entertaining webinar. Without further ado, let's start with Dr. Connie Zotos.
Thank you, Dave. Really appreciate it. First of all, let me reiterate what Dave just said about not being an indictment against coaches. I love coaches. No group of people I'd rather be around. So anything I say today is out of total respect. And I think we need to find ways to celebrate those coaches that are great role models, great leaders, and create great experience for athletes. Today's topic, though, are about the behaviors that continue to plague the coaching profession. We're all very aware of the most egregious ones. The media covers them vociferously, and you sit there saying, how can that possibly happen? I believe that there are a lot of lesser coaching behaviors out there. I've experienced them, I've seen them, that then lead to these egregious behaviors. So let's stop them at that point. So I'm going to focus my remarks on the three things that I think prevent us from getting a handle on these problems. The first one, as Dave mentioned, and I think will be mentioned across the board, is a lack of a nationally accredited coach education program. And let's take a step back in history for a minute. You know, decades and decades ago, the good majority of our coaches at all levels came out of physical education programs or exercise science. I was a physical education major. I had courses in care and prevention of athletic injuries, sports ethics, sports psychology. I was taught how to teach motor skills, how to teach strategies, really good teaching techniques. I had all the sciences, biomechanics, exercise science, and I definitely had the foundational knowledge of practice planning to go out there and start as a coach. Was it enough? No. Coaching is a very complex profession, and we need, even more professional development. But we definitely had the basics. Additionally, we were faculty, and so we had that esprit de corps of being teachers first and foremost, rather than winning first and foremost. But that's not where we are today. You know, today we have many coaches. I hired coaches who were MBAs or who had degrees in mathematics that did not have any of this foundational information. And it was up to them, through their own volition, to go to clinics, learn their X's and O's, go to workshops. There's programming out there, but there are no real requirements that where we can assure athletes and their parents that we have the experts on the fields. So that's the first real problem. And with that problem, what we have is coaches who tend to coach the way they were coached as athletes, or if they're starting as an assistant, how they're head coaches. And if there are questionable behaviors in those experiences, they tend to recycle them. And that's why it keeps going and going. So that's the first thing, is lack of education, which leads me to my second point. We take these potentially underprepared folks and we put them into a school system. A school system is a professional bureaucracy, and the characterization of that is that the main labor force, in this case faculty, have complete autonomy over their classroom with very, very little supervision. And so we put coaches in there and we say, you're just like a faculty member, even though they mostly are not faculty members. And we give them all of those rights and privileges and responsibilities with very little supervision. And it's a shame. And we tend to circle, some athletic programs tend to circle their wagons, and they put themselves aside, away from the academic community. And do we realize that we have people in our academic community, we have faculty who teach courses in leadership, HR management, psychology, maybe even sports psychology, that could help with the training of our coaches, but instead we isolate our coaches and we never use the resources that are there. Also, we have too many faculty out there who put their hands up and don't want to be anywhere near athletics because they think of it as strictly a command and control environment that is the antithesis of education. So we don't even have we don't even use the resources that we have on our own campuses to help in this regard. And then my third point is a total failure of leadership by the collective. And what do I mean by the collective? I mean our national governing organizations, our conference offices, our campus administrators to educate coaches. And in my time in the business, there was almost a resistance to doing that. To supervise coaches, to create an environment that says, here is our department, here's the culture of our department, here's what it means to be a professional in our athletic department, here are the expectations. We don't set those strongly enough. We don't supervise the coaches strongly enough, and then they fail. And then what's our reaction? It's usually one of two things. We sweep it under the rug or we fire them. In my mind, until we get a program that educates coaches, gives them the tools to be successful, and create a collaborative educational supervisory model, I believe these behaviors are going to persist. And we keep blaming the coaches, but really, who's to blame? You know, this has to start from the top down. This is a leadership concern. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Connie. Dan?
Thanks, David. My name is Dan Lytle. I'm the current head lacrosse coach at Drew University. Connie's remarks were really well thought out, and I thought well articulated, and I appreciate just being part of such an esteemed panel. And thanks to Drake Group and 2-a-days for putting this on. Thanks to everyone out there listening. I think for me, I was an athlete. I kind of joke around with the players that I coach that I'm an athlete first. I played at a really small school. I actually played at Drew University, small Division III school, and a lot of my story is around sort of where things went for me afterward. I graduated. I was the first graduate assistant at Tufts University, and now Tufts is a national power. But at the time, it was kind of evolving program in lacrosse. Academically, it was a strong institution. I was left kind of scratching my head as to how there could be such a firm disconnect between the prowess of the academic ecosystem at a university like that and the differential between where academics was and where athletics was. And as time went on at Tufts, the athletics caught up. But to be frank, I was really close with that story, and I saw the effort that the head coach at the time, who's now at Brown, Mike Daly, put into development for himself and development for his staff, and that was a big focus around, even aside from X's and O's, just what does it mean to be a leader? What does it mean to be a cohesive team? At the same time, I was coaching. I was an administrator on a campus. I was the grant writer at CW Post at the time, and coaching as an assistant. I was volunteering with their women's program, and I was experiencing a different type of culture and environment than maybe I was used to. I was really fortunate. I had outstanding coaches all through my career, but working with women opened my eyes to the power of connection and passion and inspiration. And from there, I went on to get a degree in sports psychology and really run down interests and motivation and team development and leadership development. All the while, I was playing a lot. I went from a really small school in Division III, and I wound up playing professionally. I played for a U.S. national team. I played in multiple world championships with Ireland, and really had a broad experience as a player. And as I evolved on sort of like a parallel track academically and just pursuing my personal intellectual interests, I started working with athletic organizations, but also what really opened my eyes was how much corporate America invests in development, in leadership development, team development, wanting to be the best they can be. And as someone who is finishing up a PhD program and trying to figure out what my next move was going to be, doors started opening up to consult with different types of organizations. And so at the time I was leveraging that against working with athletic organizations. But sometimes, and I find this fascinating, and I'd be interested to hear questions related to it. The rich tend to get richer. The organizations with the most resources are the ones that can invest, and they can bring in consultants, they can bring in sports psychologists, whatever it might be. But the ones with the less resources sometimes struggle to be able to get the support that they could benefit from. And to that end, I've kind of been in different paths related to this general conversation. But as an athlete, I've experienced cultures that are less effective, and I've also experienced cultures that are incredibly effective. And the ones that are most effective, whether we're talking about sports or corporations, as a coach or as a player, are the ones that tend to create a degree of cohesion and connectivity among the people, and where the people really care about each other, and there's a tremendous attempt to just communicate and be supportive and align with those shared goals. So for today, I'm really eager to just kind of hear people's thoughts and dive in where appropriate around these kind of based passions of mine, which are really related to performance and being the best we can be. And I've worked with teams that have won championships, college championships, high school championships, and I've worked with corporations that are incredibly successful. But again, the connective tissue is typically around how people are treating each other, and they're treating each other with a lot of compassion, and in most cases, actually, like a lot of love, a lot of love for the individuals in the room, and a lot of love and passion for the goals that they want to achieve.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dan. We'll go to Vincent for his opening comments.
Thanks, David, and thank you, Julie, for the invitation to be a part of this webinar. Thanks to Two-A-Days for the support in putting it together. Really excited for this conversation. My name is Vincent Harris. I'm with the Sport and Society program of the Aspen Institute. Our work focuses on the development of healthy communities through sport, and we do that work through a combination of research, thought leadership, and coalition building. As a project manager, I work in the area of coaching. I think it's an understatement to say that I think a lot about coaching and love coaching, and really care about the way in which we support, develop, manage, and hold accountable coaches. And I think the accountability piece is an interesting and important part of that conversation today. For some context, I actually quit my corporate job in my early 20s, and I was a basketball trainer for 3 years in my parents' backyard. I fell into coaching because my dad was a coach, and I loved youth basketball, and I loved coaching kids. I suppose that my journey took a little bit of a turn when I decided to go into coaching research instead of becoming a professional coach or a full-time coach. And I earned my master's in education from UC Berkeley in the Cultural Study of Sport and Education program, where I worked actively with college athletes in the Cal Athletic Department. I suppose I took it another step and took a change by going international. I missed high school coaching, and I missed youth coaching. And I moved to New Zealand to do a PhD in coaching and pedagogy, where I worked actively in the grassroots coach development sector, really for about 8 years in New Zealand, learning the trade of coach development. And I think there's a nice merger of interest for me in this conversation between what we can learn internationally, how it applies to our US system, which is crazy, very, very crazy. I suppose my opening comments, I want to start by saying setting the stage about where we're at in the coaching profession, particularly around how we think about coaching behavior and coach learning, particularly from a sort of macro systems change perspective, because it's not straightforward. I think one of the things to consider, in this context of abusive and harmful coaching behaviors, which we all know need to be stamped out, is that a lot of these extreme behaviors, which we see through the news, emerge from the normalization of psychological and emotional abuse in everyday practice. We're thinking here about things like belittling, humiliating, shouting, scapegoating, rejecting, ignoring, denying attention, denying support. These kind of everyday behaviors that problematically have been sort of endorsed, accepted, tolerated as practices that actually facilitate improvement in teams. This is the core issue that I think our system needs to be thinking about. How do we eliminate the normal? How do we shift the culture of coaching to eliminate the endorsement or tolerance of these kinds of practices, which seem harmless in their individual moments, but over time aggregated create a culture that's toxic and we know leads to these horrible outcomes. I think to kind of set that up, I would point to a recent article. Interestingly, it's not that recent; it's 10 years old, but I came across it recently in preparation for this from Ashley Sterling, who's a Canadian researcher, on why do coaches engage in emotionally abusive behavior? And when you ask them, why did you pull that player's hair and throw them out the class out of practice? Why did you do something that is obviously horrible and you shouldn't do? You get some interesting responses. One, I just got caught up in the moment, which, okay. Two, it's normalized. This is what I saw previous coaches do. I've been exposed to techniques like this. And three, they believe that it helps facilitate improvement. They believe that it's part of making athletes better. And I think there's an interesting irony and tension and conflict and contradiction in thinking about the use of harmful behaviors, because it's often rationalized as a benevolent approach. This is what I need to do because I care about my athletes so much. And that's obviously a massive problem in the way in which we prepared coaches for this work. We simply haven't prepared them. We haven't engaged in a systematic approach to preparing them for how to motivate, for how to develop. And when you ask them how they changed, it's interesting to think about why they changed their behavior, because they did. And they said things like, well, I matured. I started to learn that this was actually probably not the best way. You see things like self-reflection. I started questioning internally, which is an important part of coach development, is facilitating internal reflection. They started to become aware of problems because people came to them and said, I will never play sport again because of you. And then, of course, they engaged in education. They took webinars, they took workshops, they engaged in training. So it's this interesting mix of solutions that potentially have the power to change behavior. And I think when this is important for thinking about the solutions moving forward, because we need to be thinking about coaching, coach development, and coaching practice as a multi-layered practice. It's complex. It requires multifaceted solutions. It is, of course, very individual, built around how coaches understand player improvement, psychological safety, ethical decision-making, and of course themselves. But it's also environmental. We need to be thinking about the structural factors that shape coaching behavior, like the hierarchical system that's part of coaching, the reward systems, the belief that winning is do or die in sport and that I have to win to survive. And then, some of the organizational and motivational values inherent to sport programs. Dominant values around, toxic masculinity being one of them, and a shared belief that in order to get players to where we want to go, we need to engage in these bullying tactics to, break them down, to build them up, things of that nature. So I think there's obviously a complex environment we're working with. Formal education is going to play a role, but it by itself is not going to be the whole solution. We do need education to help coaches understand healthy coaching tactics, also understanding the risk factors that are associated with abuse, harassment, and maltreatment. But we also need to appreciate some of the natural learning that occurs and the social learning that occurs in environments themselves. Coaching is nonlinear. Coaching is context specific. It's hard to standardize coaching. And so we need to engage in everyday organizational practices and policies that support the principles and concepts that we know we need to teach in the educational programming that we know we don't have. I'm excited as we go through this, and I'll stop here, but to talk a little bit about what a sort of ideal system could look like. We just gave testimony at the Olympic Commission 2 weeks ago, talking about the need for a national coaching strategy. Our position at the Aspen Institute is really that we need a whole systems approach that combines a subset of incentives, a subset of mandates, but also support tools and a culture shift around coaching. And excited to talk about what that looks like internationally and to share other thoughts as we go through this panel.
Great. Thank you, Vince. And Wayne, you're up.
Hey, thank you so much. Appreciate you all pulling us together. And thanks to everyone for the invitation and the opportunity really to be engaged in a conversation that is super important. I think everyone that has spoken has really, they've laid out the issue, the concerns, the challenges. I think I'll take a bit of a different approach. But before that, just a little bit about, again, I serve as the executive director for the National Council of Youth Sports, member organization that a number of different types of groups, national community-based orgs, localized mom and pop groups, some organizations out of the Olympic movement, park and rec and destination marketing organizations. Spent time with Boys and Girls Clubs of America and some time in park and rec and what seems like another life, some time with the real Cleveland Browns and the Detroit Lions. And so, I've had an opportunity to see sport from a number of different lenses. When I look now at what's occurring, it occurs to me that this issue that we're talking about is akin to being like a frog that's in a pot that has had a slow simmer on it. And over the course of years, things have happened, and now we find ourselves in the situation that we're in. And what I mean by that is part of the problem, I think, is the commercialization of sport itself, of youth sport itself. If we go back 40 years or more, there's some of us who may be on this call who can remember when sport was self-directed. Young people did their own thing, organized their own games, created their own rules. Over the course of time, with the commercialization of sport, that I think has created, a challenge. As Vince has noted, we're in a fragmented youth sport ecosystem. And so it's in a lot of ways like the wild, wild west. Everyone is kind of doing their own thing based on, what they think, what they see, or whatever the case may be. I think one of the fundamental issues is that there's no agreed upon core competencies that coaches need. I recall, I've got a 21-year-older that's come up through the sports system, and in his first sport experience, he was 6. I registered him for a basketball program, and while I was in line, someone pulled me from the line and said, "Hey, we need you to be a coach." They didn't know me. They didn't know what my background was. They didn't do any background screening, but there was the need for someone. Essentially, they needed a body to help coach and run a program, and that too is a part of the problem. Lots of focus on skills and drills, far less on some of the other issues that are critical. And then fundamentally, I think in a lot of cases, coaches are asked to do a lot of things, and the question becomes, what's the priority? What's the importance of what they're being asked to do? And then I think one of the last things, just from a problematic perspective, is the parental pressure, and I think this is all tied back to the commercialization. So on one hand, parents don't oftentimes have a real sense of what good looks like. And so, the proxy for a good program may be that the program won the U9 championship, or they participated in a program in Florida, in a tournament in Florida. And then we also live in a time, where we've got professional athletes that are making some ungodly sums of money. And so if little Johnny or Sally can just, make it to the league, hey, we'll be on easy street. And so I think those are some of the challenges. And inside of the challenges, clearly, are the solutions. We definitely need to be thinking about a systems approach to this problem. There are way too many ad hoc kind of opportunities that we look at. We need to be looking at, hey, what's the systems approach to solving this, coming back again to, these issues of core competencies, and thinking about what are the types of trainings that coaches need, and in what order. And then in some ways we've got, too many resources, but we don't have enough resources. So in the day of the internet, there's all kind of information, but in some ways there's too much information. So we don't always know what's the most appropriate, critical, information that we should follow. And then finally, again, I just think about, educating parents as being a part of the overall process and this systemic approach. And, again, I've got a young man that's participated, and for all the successes that he may have had in his high school and days and so forth, the things that really resonated with me most were looking at the skills that he attained by participating in sport. And for me, as I think about his development as an individual, I'm most concerned about that. And how do we take sport and really use it as a development tool, so that we've got a generation of young people that are, going to be productive members of society. So I'll leave it there. Happy to be a part of this conversation. And the one thing that I'll also just elevate up, and I'm sure it'll come up, is really this need to think about the social and emotional engagement of young people. But in a lot of ways, we've got broken people, coaches who are dealing with their own trauma, that are also working with young people who may be traumatized in their own right. So we need to really be thinking about the social emotional aspect of all of this. And again, with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, some really interesting opening comments that raised a lot of questions. I see many of you of the attendees have put some questions in the Q&A block, and we will get to those. I'll kind of mix them up with some questions that I already have, but I was even feverishly writing down some things as the statements were going, even that opened up some new questions for me. But I wanted to start with you, Vince. I think talking about the macro level and drawing on your international experience, and then I would like the others to comment on it. But what are the competencies and aspects of a national coach training certification, certainly not just at the intercollegiate level, but at all levels, that you've seen in other countries? And what can we do in America in maybe the quickest and most streamlined way possible to get to a point of where we're not, although I'm sure Wayne was a fine basketball coach, not grabbing him out of the line and saying, hey, we need you to coach, that there are some actual competencies and things that have to be met, at least minimal floor standards, to be coaching at any level in America.
Yeah, it's an important question. I appreciate the opportunity to sort of kick off some of this Q&A. A couple of things to preface the answer here. One being that there is not going to be a straightforward adoption of some other country's model in the US. It's just, we're too big, we're too complex, but we can learn a lot from what's happening internationally. And there are a couple important starting points before you even get to the conversation about coach training and certification. One is that internationally, you have to start with, is there a leading agency? And I think this is interestingly part of the dialogue that's happening internationally. I know in Europe about the design of coaching policy for a nation state is they don't even start that conversation unless there is a leading agency within the country who is responsible for coach training and development. And that is something we've never had and certainly don't have now. Because that entity is often connected to a sport development agency. So it's usually a department within a national agency. In the country that I just spent the last 8 years in, New Zealand, Sport New Zealand is an entity dedicated to grassroots sport. And they really sort of are the coordinating body for not just coaching, but a number of other sport development related practices. But in the context of coaching, you need a coordinating body who works with your national governing bodies and the other governing institutions. In this case, in the U.S., obviously the NCAA would be a sort of regulatory body that would work from a college coach's perspective. So you need a regulatory or coordinating group who can organize the space. And then what you need is a set of coaching plans. So you need coaching plans that are focused on the various well-defined sub-communities, right? We haven't defined our coaching communities well from that sort of like macro perspective. So you define your coaching communities, you define who's responsible, and you have this coordinating agency working across these various entities to ensure that they're aligned with each other. So we need to make sure that the alignment is not just around what they're trained in, but even before that, what is good coaching, but what does long-term coach development mean? What are the pathways across our system and how do they interweave with one another? So right now, if you think about the different communities that we have, professional sport communities, college sport communities, Olympic sport communities, high school sport communities, youth and recreation communities, sport-based youth development communities, and of course, club communities. That's a lot of communities in the U.S., right? That have coaches. What I think happens in other countries, again, albeit smaller, is there is a clear alignment between the youngest, most recreational settings all the way through to professional and elite sport, including Olympic level. What's different about the US is the juggernaut of college sports. No one else has our system of college sports. And because of that, it's this sort of giant elephant in the room where we have the highest paid but least prepared coaches, right, from a pure coaching perspective. So I think that's sort of the important caveat in this conversation is, we need to start with a very intentional big picture view led by a leading agency that links together these coaching communities around plans that are built around what we know good coaching is, what we know good coach development is. The last comment I'll say is that I think as it concerns, this question of training and development and what does good coaching look like? The National Standards for Sport Coaches is a great document. It's an American document from Shape America. It is a very robust, very thoughtful, very meticulously organized set of coaching standards. The problem is we've never activated it. We've never built coach education programming across these ecosystems in that way. It is an amazing resource that I think we need to be taking advantage of more.
Hey, Vince, just a note about that. I would concur with you 100% on everything that you've said. And as I think about the coaching standards specifically, again, fantastic resource. If you go out and you ask most people about that resource or about the standards, out of 100 people, you're probably going to find 98 who have no idea what you're talking about, what I'm talking about. And therein lies part of the challenge. So there are significant resources that are in the space that would make a difference. And if people knew that they existed, would actually make a difference. But, again, part of that issue that I was referring to in terms of there's so much information that sometimes we're not even clear about how to get to the right information.
Right. And Connie, I was going to say, Vince, I'm sorry, you go ahead and comment.
No, my last, just to close this up, I agree with Wayne that we have tools and resources that are amazing here, but we haven't leveraged them in the way that we should. And I think Wayne's right that we have great tools that we need to sort of translate into practices, certainly from a coach development, coach governance, coach accountability perspective. And I think that's the difference internationally, that internationally, if you go to any national governing body, particularly, again, I'll use my experience in New Zealand, but these NSOs that are thinking about coach development, the good ones, they're linking the pathway from junior sport all the way up to senior sport. And that pathway is based on a common set of principles around what great coaching looks like. It looks different at the highest levels. It's not going to literally be the same thing, but it's grounded in the same principles. And it's grounded in research, which I think is something that we have not systematically done in this country.
Right. And going to Connie and then to Dan, I mean, at least with you two, it seems like you have had at least those core competencies and the training in the sense maybe it wasn't formalized. Connie, you went through the things that you studied. From a college coach perspective now, coming down, maybe make it a little bit more of a micro level. I was struck by what Vince said, is that we have the highest paid but the least prepared coaches in college. And I would agree with that, although there are people like you and Dan that are out there. What are your recommendations just specifically in the college space? And then Dan, certainly you as a current college coach can weigh in, but we'll start with you, Connie.
Well, I think from a curriculum standpoint, first of all, I would build no curriculum, and and Vincent and Wayne are absolutely right. There's some great resources out there that can lead us, but without first doing focus groups with coaches and athletes and getting everyone's feedback in terms of what they feel their needs are, what strategies they already use and whatnot. But if we're just going to talk about my experience and the curriculum that's needed, I would start with the medical. And I think not only the medical in terms of the physical, but the emotional. And we have many coaches now who are screaming for help on the mental illness side, and how to recognize that. You know, people say, well, teaching, they know how to teach because they went and did X's and O's. I created an instrument when I was teaching coaching classes at universities, and I would train my students on them that would go out and would assess coaches in practice. And they used it from 8th grade to high school to college coaches. We measured time on task. We measured best teaching practices. We measured the types of feedback that coaches got. And really the results were pretty subpar across, whether it was a college coach or an 8th grade coach. You ask coaches, do you use reverse chaining methods when you teach motor skills? They have no idea what you're talking about. You ask them how they use biomechanical principles like line of force and sequential summation of movements, and they have no idea what you're talking about. You know, to me, great leadership starts with expertise, right? People will follow you if you're an expert and if they believe that you have their best interests at heart. And we're subjecting coaches to going in there and going by the seat of their pants and not having those kinds of opportunities. And of course, the curriculum would be much more than that. But I also think knowing coaches the way they do, they're very interactive, engaged people. And whatever we do, it can't be all online. I think even a 1-week intensive, a 2-week intensive on a college campus, you know, that may be enough to get to some of the basic fundamentals, get them speaking to each other, get them having these opportunities. And, you know, again, the medical piece, the teaching piece, the sports psychology piece, leadership, get them talking about these issues, get them talking about these behaviors that they've been that's either happened to them or that they use. And then you can follow up with great modules, online modules. Plus, in a interactive setting, they get role models. They get people who they can pick up the phone and call that they've talked to, not only during their sessions, but at dinner and during the social times, and that active engagement. So that's what I see being the direction.
And how about you, Dan, as an active coach, hearing everything that you've heard? And I think it's very clear we're disconnected here in America, that it's very much an ad hoc system. And sometimes I marvel at the success we've had athletically with the system we have. But from a coaching perspective, Dan, you know, taking your own background, you're around current coaches now. What do you think?
Yeah, I feel, well, first of all, I mean, I appreciate all the comments that are being made and the direction and the vision, and it would be beneficial in many regards. I think that to a certain extent, I'm fortunate to have been around communities that take a lot of the points that are being brought up pretty seriously. And I've actually had coaching training at the youth level. I wouldn't have been able to coach at the youth level if I wasn't. I'm not saying it's sufficient per se, but it was something. I had to take a course in person. I had to take courses online, multiple. But to the points made earlier about the collegiate ranks and even into high school, that's where it really starts to water down. So ironically, I have to take a course to coach 10-year-olds but to coach 20-year-olds, I'm good. So, and the stakes are higher, right? So to that end, I mean, just kind of like wrapping up a couple of disparate thoughts here. I think that coaching as a profession is results oriented, and I think the rubber really hits the road for coaches when they feel like they're gaining insight into how to succeed and how to win. And where I think to a certain extent, not to say that I'm pushing back, but I just thinking of conversations I have with coaches where there are question marks sometimes related to theories and research is, all right, well, how's it going to help me win? And to that end, I think there's a lot of opportunity to draw a direct line. And again, getting back to some of my opening comments, I think some of the top programs in the country actually take a lot of this really seriously, either formally baked into their process or a little bit more ad hoc, but they have personnel on staff. I mean, and a lot of this has been evolving. I mean, the Major League Baseball didn't have a player development position, player development meaning related to sports psychology, things along those lines, in every club until about 5 years ago. So like this is an evolving discussion, and I think that it's gaining a lot of traction more recently around a number of the themes that have been brought up related to mental health and expertise. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're telling coaches how they can win more games to be more successful, and it's done in a way that they can relate to, then it would have wings.
A couple logistical things that some questions have come up about the resource for the Shape America that Vince mentioned. We will post that link, and yes, I want to look at that. I do study this myself and have not seen that document, so we want to share that far and wide. And then also our next webinar is not actually the 12th, it is October 19th. I just wanted to share that. But Dan, I wanted to come back to you and start and have everybody comment on this. So everything we've mentioned so far about some improvements, some best practices, things we can do organizationally, how do those things then specifically go to the core issue we're talking about today, minimizing, if not eliminating, abusive coaching practices?
To me?
Yes, I'm sorry, Dan. Yes.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Just minimizing abusive practices. Well, again, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm a one-trick pony here, but I think for coaches and practitioners, a lot of it comes back to best practices, and abusive practices are not consistent with high performance in any industry anywhere in the world. They're not sustainable. So that I think there's an opportunity to put that front and center. And it's hard because I've had this conversation for those of you listening and sort of thinking about your coach from when you were however old. I've had those coaches too. I've had coaches do egregious things. But I think the question that me and a lot of my peers have had conversation around is, do we want to be like that? Or are we motivated to be different? And in the process of being motivated to be different, we also see that success can be found beyond just some of, as Connie's phrase it, some of the boorish behavior. Yeah, that's happened, and maybe perhaps we've seen even documentaries, and there's almost a glamorization of those hardline coaches from the 50s and 60s and beyond. But that there are other ways to win too. And I've been part of it. I've seen it. I mean, I've been with teams that have won the national championship. I've been with teams that have won high school state championships. And there's a lot of compassion and support, and that's what's gotten them to where they ultimately wind up.
I'd like to add
ahead.
something to that. I always tell coaches you should start from a position of athletes want to be there, athletes want to improve, and athletes want you to direct them. And if they believe that you have their best interests at heart and the team's best interests, they will follow. Unfortunately, we have a lot of coaches who believe today, and about history, they're too soft. They start from that position. Athletes are too soft. We've got to toughen them up. Wayne said, or someone said, we have to break them down. And that's the complete wrong position to start with. So if they can start from the right mindset and really buy into that and believe it and believe what's right. I mean, I cannot tell you, as an athletic director, every person that worked in my department, even to the third assistant, had to finally meet with me. And when they were being interviewed, I'd say, okay, you've met with your head coach. They'll make the total decision of who's right for their program, blah, blah, blah. However, now you need to assess whether we're the right fit for you. And I would talk about our culture and the types of behaviors that we would tolerate, what we wouldn't tolerate, and why. And then they'd come on board and then they'd screw up. And I'd say, and they'd come to my office and I'd say, okay, do you remember this conversation? And they'd say, yeah, but I didn't realize you meant it. And I'd say, well, why do you feel that way? Because everybody says it. Everybody says we're going to be professional. We're going to be, kids first, teaching first, but nobody means it. And so I had to get into this way of acting that I mean it, and I mean it because, and that's a whole culture shift, an entire culture shift that has to happen.
And that's what it shows what leadership really can have an effect on. So Vince, I know you want to chime in on this.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Connie and what Dan have shared just briefly. I think a couple of things. One is I think Dan's right on in terms of this challenge of acknowledging this tension between how does learning fit into my goals, particularly the desire to win and compete, and how abusive practices no longer are really not high performance. I couldn't agree with that more. I think that there's a really important conversation that Connie's hit on around the role of leadership and the tolerance of practices that really the research has told us, our experiences in observing great coaches have taught us about what role do administrators and does the culture of the athletic department play in the normalization of the behaviors that precipitate the extreme ones, right? And again, it's some of those ones I highlighted at the beginning. And so one of the questions that I'm asking and would love to sort of ask is like, how are we preparing the athletic directors and the leaders of those programs? What is their view and sense of what great coaching looks like? How are they sort of introducing expectations of coaches? How are they, to what extent are they creating a culture of learning among coaches? I know this is a really interesting phenomenon of coaches, that coaches don't like talking to each other about their practice with someone who's not in their sport. And I think it's a huge missed opportunity for coaches, particularly as we go down this path of relationship building, of culture building, motivation. I'm sure there are programs out there that do this well, who have struck that chord. But I know that across the world, this is a problem. This is not just unique to the US, that creating a culture of learning and among coaches feels like a crazy idea, much like the idea that coaches should have a degree in coaching or physical education in order to be eligible for this field, which of course shouldn't be a crazy idea, as Connie mentioned. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from classroom teachers, right? Like high school teachers in the context of, degree and there's a very robust preparation process you have to go through. And then when you enter, there is a culture or style, and in the best places, I think, around how we teach our kids. There's consistency across the teachers, but it's obviously manifested different in my classroom because these kids are slightly different from the kids in your classroom and so forth. And so I think that there's a really interesting movement I think we need to embrace coach learning and really building that around, do we have a culture of learning in our program where coaches come together and learn from each other? Are those conversations grounded in the research on what great high performance coaching looks like, which of course is not abusive? And is that all aligned with the educational preparation programs where they would have been initially exposed to those ideas? I think that you need to kind of start bringing those pieces together.
Yeah, I definitely want to touch on the leadership aspect, but I do want to go to Wayne and have you comment on what we're talking about. But I think, Wayne, rightly or wrongly, merited or not, a lot of the abusive coaches practices that we hear about or see are in your space, in the youth sports space. And maybe that, and I don't even think maybe, I think a lot of that has trickled down because it has even become in the youth sports space kind of a win at all costs. Well, Wayne, you have more coaches than anyone under your purview, what from a leadership perspective and things that you're doing in the youth sports aspect and maybe developing future college coaches, what are some of the things that you're doing to try to prevent these abusive practices? And then I want to address the leadership aspect in college athletics more after this.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're engaged in right now is really taking a look at what we consider to be best practice in the space, and primarily as we're beginning to introduce a culture of safety strategy, and really thinking about, hey, what are the elements of that, and what are the practices that support it. And it's interesting. I was at a meeting of chief executives in sport just a couple of weeks ago, and to tie a couple of pieces together, one of the things that got underscored during that meeting is that for those who are even in the high performance space, if you don't care about social emotional learning, training, resiliency, if you don't care about that, you actually don't care about winning. And part of what, why I say that is because, it's clear that, we've come close perhaps to maximizing all of the other elements inside of high performance in terms of training, physical training and the like. And so a coach that does not have the ability to assist their athletes, from an emotional and social, emotional, mental perspective, actually is negatively impacting performance. So anyway, I just wanted to underscore that point, just to make that very clear. So again, part of what we're really looking to do is to take a look at how we begin to, identify what good looks like, and then to begin to do some of the things that we're talking about in this conversation. To as we develop the standards, we will then move forward and begin to have focus groups with organizations in the space, so that we're really getting feedback around what they have to say about what we're finding. We're drawing upon some of the resources that currently exist. We seek not to reinvent the wheel. Lots of resources, as we've identified, have already been created. We want to, as an organization that has its tentacles with lots of different organizations, we want to really be that organization to help pull together the sector, the space, provide those resources, provide the kind of conversations that need to be had. We're not interested in serving in a compliance role, but we are interested in providing those resources in a way that make difference for organizations, for coaches and administrators, and for parents.
Thank you, Wayne. I wanted to circle back and start again with you, Connie. I think we have to face it, and specifically in college athletics, but certainly in high school athletics and in youth sports. It has really come down to a win at all cost mentality. And let's face it, if coaches are abusive and they are winning at a high level, we'll often cover for them. We'll make excuses, but then we'll use it as an excuse to fire them if they're not performing as well, instead of enforcing the standard of you're an abusive coach and you need to be terminated. A question from following up on that, and then a question from the audience is, should we have the power in America to ban coaches? Not a show cause like you see in the NCAA, or somebody like a Rush Probst at Alabama being able to move from job to job. Should we have the power to ban coaches at all levels?
I believe we should, if we've prepared them. It's one thing to do something that's over the top when you know better. It's another thing when that's all you've experienced and you think it's okay. How many of these practices have been going on and on and on and accepted, and like you say, put under the rug, and then all of a sudden it becomes public, and now the switch, and now you're fired, now it's all your fault. And it goes back to that leadership thing. And as a matter of history with the leadership, again, where we used to be physical education majors, then we became athletic directors. We had already coached. And if we had had the mindset that we liked the autonomy of coaching and that we liked not being supervised and we liked doing whatever we did, we weren't going to impose our will then on coaches. And so again, we didn't have the leadership, that we needed. And, actually, a lot of when I went into training coaches and being an athletic director, it's because of the mistakes I made. And I remember I did something when I was a high school coach that really just still haunts me. And I remember one of the athletes called just to catch up about 10 years later. And I said, I'm so glad you're calling. And I want you to know that I really regret blah, blah, blah. And so she said, well, that's great. She said, who better than to be training other coaches? And, that really resonated with me. Who better than? Yeah, I made mistakes. I'm not all knowledgeable, all powerful, but anything I can do to help coaches. And I will tell you, in my opening remarks, I said there was almost a resistance. I got on this bandwagon when I was an athletic director that this had to happen. We had to create these educational opportunities for coaches. And at one point, I was on the NCAA Management Council in Division III. But when you went to NCAA Management Council meetings, the Division I Management Council was there, Division II. Miles Brand was the executive director, some conference commissioners, all the people in power positions were there. And I said, this is my opportunity. And I went around and I spoke to all of them, including Miles. And I explained to Miles his problem of not having the educational background. And he said, wow, he had been a college president. He said, I never really thought about it. And you're right, it's a problem. And he says, but I don't think should be at our level. I think it's conferences, campuses. I said, well, how about resources? Well, possibly, to help create this programming and fund this program. And then I went to the next level and the next level and the next level. And I will tell you, the resistance was like unbelievable. And even my colleagues, my peers, I went to many of them and said, we really have to do this. And they'd say, we figured it out. They'll figure it out. I said, we were PE majors. We had some background. Yeah, well, one athletic director, very good friend of mine, it's not my job to train coaches. And I said, well, whose job is it? And, I'm embarrassed to say that after facing so much resistance, I kind of gave up. And now I'm kind of back on the bandwagon, so happy to be on this panel talking to other people who are this passionate and this concerned about it. And I could say to the audience, if anybody else out there wants to get going on this at any level, count me in. I'd love to be part of it.
Dan, what are your thoughts as a current coach? Should coaches be able to be banned permanently or for a significant portion of time?
Yeah, I don't. I'm a coach, so I think that I think that coaches often are. I don't obviously not banned, but they are thrust into the public light and they're criticized, and I think sometimes I really am gravitating towards some of the comments around viewing this from a systems perspective and taking a more holistic vantage point, in the sense that coaches they're not working in vacuums. And I'm keeping track of some of the questions and answers and the expectations of coaches. I'm at a wonderful institution that I played at and I have a tremendous affinity for, and this is not some commentary on where I am. I'm at a place that is incredibly well resourced and supported. With all that said, I'm driving guys to doctor's appointments on any given day. I'm talking to guys about where they are with their relationships. I'm checking in on guys' grades. There's 2 guys I just caught up with about a test in the last hour. I teach a course here at where I'm at. I think that where there are a lot of real challenges for coaches is the expectations that are put on them. And so the idea of banning people, to Connie's point, who may not even know better or who get tangled up in the pressures, that's a fascinating discussion in itself. So coaches be judged on their win-loss record on many levels. Yeah. On other levels, I don't know. I mean, when you're making 50 $100,000 a year and you're being told you might lose your job because you didn't win, which happens, I think that that's a travesty. When you're making, $15 million a year, maybe that's a different conversation. And so, and these are real, there's a lot of meat to the bone where you start. I think a conversation like this is tremendously valuable, and it's obviously not wholly new. Someone made the comment about Dan Gould talking about this for a couple of decades. I mean, there's been a lot of thought around this, and I think maybe we're at a bit of an inflection point as a society. I mean, the United States is not dominant in all the sports as it has been in decades past, and I think we're seeing more and more challenges. And COVID, I think, brought to light a lot related to the value of mental health, and also the value of what athletics can provide people in relation to mental health. So the only other thing I want to say, just in case you don't come back around to me, for anyone who is a coach and anyone who does hear that argument about athletes being soft, I need to get this out there. That is something that is said a lot, and I think it's important to keep in mind. Records are going to be broken this year. So however soft these athletes are, they are going to break a record this year. They're going to break records next year, and it's going to keep on going. We don't know what we're capable of, and our job is to inspire them to just keep on pushing. And they keep moving forward. So to me, again, when it's centered around performance and how to move them forward, coaches are quick to take a step back and get on board. I think when it's centered around fear and threats, in the same way athletes recoil from that, coaches will too.
Okay, Vince.
Yeah, I really agree with Dan here on so many points. I think that the question of should we be able to ban coaches is an interesting question, in part because I think it's a question that's symptomatic of the way in which we often respond to issues in coaches, which is we kind of like immediately jump to how can we penalize, punish, instill fear, or create these sort of systems of even greater challenge on them. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to ban them. It's more of to the point that Connie made, which is if we want to go down that path, to what extent have we actually appropriately supported, introduced, and created an environment where they can succeed and not have to resort to the tactics that would result in banning, right? And so you think about a few things. One is there's been a conversation internationally, I would say, for the last 10, 15 years about the professionalization of coaching. And one of the issues is the drawing of boundaries, right? The problem being, have we clearly articulated the role, the job, right? Dan saying, I got to drive people here, I've got to help them with class here, right? Like there is a still ambiguity about what the role of the coach is and what success in coaching is. And if we haven't done a good enough job of articulating that in a healthy way, that's not just win-loss record, then I think we're doing coaches a little bit of a disservice. I would also add that this support that we're offering coaches is an important part of setting them up for success. So you ask questions like, to what extent have we done what's happened internationally, which is create a network of coach developers, right? Folks who are responsible for helping coaches. And this is probably quite a bit at the youth level, the high school level. I'd love to see it more in that space. We're very actively working on the youth sports space from a coaching perspective. Well, how are we supporting coaches, and can we provide them with individuals who are knowledgeable, not just about what great coaching is, but how coaches develop and learn, about facilitating reflection on their practice, about introducing them to ideas and concepts, and about creating community among coaches. That is a very common practice internationally, to have coach developers who are systematically trained in adult learning and development, who know coaching. I think if we want to go down the path of being able to say, can we ban coaches? I think we need to ask ourselves, have we appropriately supported coaches to succeed? And have we built the systems where they can access the support they need, they can really thrive? And I think there's a lot of layers to that, some of which are organizational, some are institutional, and system-wide. So I just would be conscious of that, because at the youth level, and this will be my last comment, at the youth level, the more we know there's a huge tension in supply of coaches, and every decision that we make around instituting a new kind of mandate or threat on them around behavior, also creates the problem of reducing our coaching population, right? Why would I do this coaching role if there's so many reasons why I could get fired or kicked out? So it's a tension. I'm not saying that there's an easy answer, but it's a huge tension that we have to be conscious of. And we want more coaches to want to coach because it's enjoyable and they're supported.
It's an interesting dichotomy. As somebody who was a former youth sports official, I just got out of it because of some of the same reasons that you said, as from a coaching perspective. And I hadn't really thought about it, that's also, affecting coaches. So, Wayne, knowing again at your, developmental level, and with a lot of coaches who maybe don't have the experience who are thrust into it and maybe become abusive, should they be banned?
Well, so first of all, I think we ought to also be clear about the facts. So the U.S. Center for Safe Sport does have a centralized disciplinary database. Now, organizations that are a part of the national governing bodies that roll up into the USOPC are chiefly in that world. But what's interesting about that, and for the most part, those individuals, the center takes a look at issues of abuse. For issues of social and emotional abuse, they push those back to the individual national governing body. So on one hand, I just wanted to point to that there is a centralized database that points to a number of individuals that are on a banned list, if you will. There also is a question about, and one that came up during the meeting of chief executives that I was attending. Should there be a national database that goes beyond the U.S. Center for Safe Sport and that group that really would allow for individuals to see and to identify bad apples. So again, I think there's a lot to get to before we get there, but I do think that it's important to simply know, particularly for those that are in the youth space, as they are looking for coaches, that they should identify, look at the centralized database list. It's published. You can go there. You can see who's on the list, which organization they've been a part of. And so that's, I think, a helpful thing to know.
But we have so many great questions, and unfortunately, we're running out of time. I do want to remind the attendees that we will be following up as a panel in answering these questions in our notes. But now I want to turn it back to the athlete at all levels, and certainly focusing more on the college space, as that is the topic of the webinar. But going back to you, Connie, what is the recourse of the athlete? Oftentimes, if there's the powerful, successful coach, even the athletic director, the president, may not want to. And then certainly even at the high school level, you see this, or at the youth sports level. What can we do to empower the athlete so they can have a reporting mechanism and then ensure that is taken to heart?
Yeah. The strategy I used was I met with every team every year at the beginning of the season, and I would tell them what our expectations were of them, and then I would tell them what their expectations should be of us, and if we deviated from those expectations, we needed to know it. And they may not feel comfortable. I would say, if you can go to your coach first. If there's something that's concerning you, if that doesn't feel good, my door is always open to you. But if you don't want to stay within the athletics realm, if you have a concern, we have a faculty athletics rep, any faculty member on this campus, anyone on campus that can come and advocate for you. I was in a very special situation because I was a voting member of the faculty too. And every year I would get up and say, it takes a village to run an athletics program, and I need your help. And you're going to have our athletes in classes. And if you see any behaviors that you want to celebrate in athletics, I'd like to know about it. If you see any behaviors, and I'd spell out what our program was all about. So we created that synergy, and it seemed to work really well. But first, you have to educate athletes on what they should expect and what they shouldn't. be seeing, right? And then I also was the one that went in and did the final evaluations of coaches with the athletes. And I talk about the importance of those. This is their career, whereas this is to make them better. It's not for retaliation or retribution. We're not really asking you about your own playing time. We're asking you about, did they meet these expectations? So I would get feedback that way as well. And again, I think it worked pretty well. Unfortunately, most people don't set up those kinds of systems. And the other thing is, in terms of athletics leadership, m- many athletic directors now have never even coached. Definitely not at the higher levels. You're hiring attorneys, fundraisers, MBAs, lawyers, right? And they've never coached. Now, in those programs, though, they usually have enough layers. And I would say to them, you have to have a layer of people who were practitioners, who did coach. I mean, you're absolutely right. Coaches don't want to hear from people that have not coached. I think, like I said earlier, we have faculty on campus that can come in and talk about group dynamics, group behavior. I mean, we had a national championship at Drew once, and I gave all the coaches there the book Good to Great. One of the coach, and I explained to them, this is not a sport book. This is about organizational leadership. I said, but you can take these principles and you can adopt them and put them into your team. I had a coach call me and say, I don't get it. I don't understand it. Can we go over it? I said, absolutely. You know, there's ways. And same thing with athletes. They need to be educated. And sometimes you give some power to athletes and they abuse it. We have to be really careful with athletes. What's the role of the captains? Is it to create a class structure? Where is the hazing coming from? Is it coming from the coach, or is it coming from this class structure where you, the coach, have given the athletes so much power, right? That they now go down this road because in high school, they were bullied from the captains of their team. So first you have to educate them, then you have to give them the resources that they can go to when they have concerns.
Interesting, like you said, that it works so many ways. And we do have a question. You touched on it. I'd like you and Dan to both comment on it, if you can. Just having the avenue of the faculty and the faculty athletic reps. And again, with due apologies to all the faculty reps that are out there, many are fans. Many are fans of the sport and really do not want to be involved as a guardian of the curriculum or really being a resource for athletes and their issues. But many are. I want to say that very clearly. What could a faculty athletic rep do at the college level to certainly be a voice for the athletes and an advocate if they don't feel comfortable going to their coach or their athletic director? You can comment on that, Dan, and certainly Connie, you can chime in, and then we'll go over to Vince.
Yeah, I don't have a quick response. That's a rich question on an already rich topic. I think, just considering whistleblower type protocols that are in place at a lot of different types of organizations. I mean, there are anonymous hotlines, there are all sorts of things that are being implemented. I have a son in high school, and I just got an email yesterday on their online protocol for anonymous concerns. I mean, those are things that are being put into place throughout the country at varying levels that range from industry to high schools and low elementary schools. So I think certainly universities could probably do themselves a service by taking note of some of these practices. And I also think that, as we've discussed, creating an environment where people feel comfortable to talk, and some of these environments, depending on it's a lot. It's a lot to be a coach and to know that you might be held accountable for the actions of a 20-year-old at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't think there's any rational conversation that can lead us to a place where we can all get on board with the fact that that's 100% the coach's fault of what the 20-year-old did at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it's also a lot to digest the reality that we have a roster of 45 guys, that if one person makes a mistake, that could negatively impact 44 people. and 44 of their careers, maybe even 44 of their reputations, depending on what actually happened. So I think that we need to try and create environments where we can have these conversations to the extent we can before bad things happen is of tremendous value. And also to create safe spaces where, should mistakes be made, we recognize it's a learning institution. Is everyone safe? If everyone's safe, then let's explore how we can make better decisions moving forward. If someone got hurt, let's make sure that person's taken care of. And now let's move forward with how we can all learn and make sure this doesn't happen again. But to be frank, a lot's happening in the course of the days at these institutions, and that's not always, those spaces aren't always made as available as they should be.
Well, since we're running short on time, I want Vince to be able to chime in, and Vince, your second responsibility is I want you to just say if you could do one thing, and I want to go rapidly to everybody else to say the one thing that they would do, and then I know Wayne wants to make a quick closing comment. So Vince, please, and then just around one thing.
My one thing will be the comment I was going to make anyway. So we'll just kind of unite those two. I think that systematic coach assessment is something that, kind of piggybacking on the evaluation. I love what Connie built. And I think the concept of really sort of systematically making coach assessment and coach evaluation a part of what we do is crucial. We partnered with Don Anderson Butcher and the Ohio State University team on a national coach survey. We had 10,000 coaches answer the survey, and more than half of them said they'd never been evaluated. Now, again, primarily grassroots coaches, but I would be curious what those numbers look like at the college level, because we know that coach evaluation, coach assessment, these kinds of practices tend to not be common in organized sport, particularly when looking at coaching behaviors. And I think that there's an answer potentially here in how we can, really define success, set expectations, also capture athlete voice through this assessment and evaluation process. Athlete voice is the critical element in challenging coaches and helping hold coaches accountable, because if you can create healthy, safe opportunities for athletes to share their voice, you're going to get honest answers. And the system of in particular, I really, really value the 360 coach evaluation approaches. Can you get a coach to self-assess, have a sort of third party, and then have a participant in their team all give perspective on the same answers? That's a really healthy process because it tends to be less kind of purely biased, and you get multiple perspectives. So that would be my answer. Let's get every coach embracing self-assessment and engaging in those kind of tools. We're working on one now, and I think that it's going to be a really important shift in the coaching environment.
Fantastic. Wayne?
Thank you. As a closing thought, I would simply invite everyone to join us for National Youth Sports Week coming up on October 2nd through the 7th. There are a variety of things that will be happening that week. There are two things that I just want to underscore. On Tuesday, we'll have training day. We've got a goal of training upwards of 10,000 coaches in injury prevention and social emotional learning. And we'll also have some training opportunities for parents as well, free of charge. And then on Friday, National Coaches Day, we'll be acknowledging coaches for all the great things that they do. But also we're looking to hear from coaches around some of the great things that they do in terms of the practices that they employ that actually make a difference. So again, that will be my closing thought.
Right. Thank you, Wayne. Connie, the one thing?
I was going to say the getting coaches and athletes' voices involved, but since that's already taken, I will say to the leadership, the coaches are your team. You have these expectations of how coaches are going to treat their teams and develop. You need to have that same commitment to your coaches. They're your team. You need to develop them. If you don't have the expertise, there's expertise out there. Invest and bring other people in to help your coaches. They deserve it.
And you'll get the last word.
I value conversations like this, and I would value more peer-to-peer conversations, whether it's a lacrosse coach or a volleyball coach, doesn't really matter to me. It's more just about how people practice their craft and how they achieve at high levels. I think more venues where that can happen in an accessible fashion, doesn't necessarily require me to reach into my budget, would be welcome.
Well, fantastic. I want to thank the panel for just, we could go on for hours. I've got 3 pages of notes here and really great comments. Obviously a very, very important topic that again, resonates not just through college athletics, but through sports at professional levels, all the way down to the scholastic and youth sports level. I think the panel was excellent. Again, I want to let everybody know that we will respond to all your questions. Sorry, we did not get to as many of them as I would like. As you can tell, that the conversation gets in depth and deep, but we will respond to your questions in our notes. And we'll also have a recording of this webinar as appended to the notes. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach us at the Drake Group or the Drake Group Education Fund on our website. So again, thank you so much for the panel. It was an excellent, excellent webinar. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much.